with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Monday, July 24th, 2023. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, David Neiwert. On the Age of Insurrection, the radical right's assault on American democracy. Also on the program today, in the wake of massive protests and setting off massive protests, the Israeli parliament passes a law to disempower its Supreme Court. Meanwhile, Russia accuses Ukraine of a Moscow drone attack as Russia hits Ukrainian grain stores. Spanish elections show a small gain for the left and a narrow defeat of the Fasci coalition. UPS and Teamsters back at the negotiations today, 7 days out from a deadline. This as the UAW and major automakers are at loggerheads over electric vehicles. SAG and AFTRA, WGA continued their strike. And as drug makers gear up to fight Medicare negotiations, Bernie Sanders' Help Committee takes step one in pursuing government-developed drugs for the public domain. Let's go. As backlash grows over Florida's enslaved benefited from slavery curriculum, DeSantis' floundering campaign enters the "we're going to let Ron be Ron" phase. Federal Mine Safety Administration finally proposing a rule to protect miners from black lung disease. New Jersey sues over the congestion pricing proposal in New York, and Elon Musk rebrands Twitter as X, as far as we can tell. It's a little bit difficult to assess that. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us at the beginning of the week. It is Monday, and Emma Vigeland, co-host of the Majority Report. Happy Monday.
Fun day Monday, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, if you say
sure.
so.
Sure.
All right.
Hi.
Hi. We get a lot to get to. I hope everybody had a fun weekend.
Fund.
Yeah. Incidentally, it's still really hot. We have record temperatures again over the course of the country, and in Europe, and it's becoming a increasingly something that a clear vision of what the future is going to be looking like in this country and other countries around the world. We're in a spike, I think, that will drop a little bit, maybe in a year or two after we get through this sort of La Nina phase, and then it will continue to go up. But the baseline is going to be higher than it was before, and I mean, this is our future. Impossible to know, that's going to be like this without any change for the better for a period of time. But this is largely, we are looking at our future and worse. People begin to understand that heat ends up being one of the most dangerous natural, it's not really a natural disaster as much as we're just not situated on the planet in such a way that we're going to be able to withstand this heat if we are, in southern parts of this country, anyways.
I think Phoenix was the first major city to average over a month period 100, or major U.S. city over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, yeah, you saw some of the forecasts there, like lots of retirees, people live out there. I mean, we're talking really scary situations if someone's air conditioning falters or if they don't have the ability to have any.
Or, the cost of associated with air conditioning that have to run that often is going to be prohibitive for a lot of people, and it's going to be, exceedingly a problem. So we'll see. Meantime, of course, we will get to all of our Barbie reporting a little bit later.
I'm seeing it tonight. So I'll be able to watch Ben Shapiro's 45-minute review and then give a review of his review, and he can review my review, and then we're talking reviewception just to give.
I'm waiting for the Stretch Armstrong movie.
Yeah,
I
did see Oppenheimer
stunning,
though, and we could talk about that later if you'd like.
Somebody's going to spend 45 minutes on a review of Barbie, but different folks, I guess, for different strokes or different stroke, whatever it goes. Meanwhile, we will get to the cratering of Ron DeSantis's campaign. But what is quite clear that long after Ron DeSantis will have become a footnote in this presidential election, Florida will still be a crap show. And there's a whole raft of problems, like material problems that Florida is facing, that Ron DeSantis has either created, exacerbated, or done nothing about. But one of them is what they're doing to their education system. And we can talk to David Neiwert about this as well, because this, I'm sure, is part, at least part of the movement that he writes about. But here is Ron DeSantis. We are sort of on the tail end of a re-examination that has taken place in this country over the past several decades of slavery, of Reconstruction, a reaction to the so-called Dunning School, which was an academic history movement, if you will, or school that promoted the idea of the lost cause, and an interpretation of the South's motivation in the Civil War that was one, I don't know if it was meant to, probably, to redirect the sense that they were fighting to protect slavery, and made it far more sort of like opaque. And the idea that Reconstruction failed in many respects because it gave too much authority to Black people, as opposed to it failed under literal physical assault by white people, and a failure of the federal government to come to the aid of Black people in southern states, at least in terms of, beyond those amendments. Here is Ron DeSantis on with CNN's Kit Maher. They have gone after the idea of talking about slavery or civil rights issues or Jim Crow or red line, whatever it is in our history as a country, of the practice of white supremacy and the mechanisms in which that undergirded it. If that was to make any student feel weird about themselves or white people, it has been outlawed in Florida.
Safe space law.
Yes, under the Stop Woke Act, or whatever they call it. And they have added to the curriculum the idea that slavery actually provided some material benefit for slaves. This is at a press conference in Salt Lake City, and CNN's Kit Maher asks about this provision in the curriculum.
instruction includes how slaves develop skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. Could you just explain why?
Well, you should talk to them about it. I mean, I didn't do it, and I wasn't involved in it. But I think what they're doing is I think that they're probably going to show some of the folks that eventually parlayed, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life. But the reality is, all of that is rooted in whatever is factual. They listed everything out. And if you have any questions about it, just ask the Department of Education. You can talk about those folks. But I mean, these were scholars who put that together. It was not anything that was done politically.
Sure.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, the way that you do this politically is you choose your scholars based upon their political orientation. And again, this is not a question of like saying that, people can't discuss what slaves did after they were freed. For the vast majority of them, the lives were very similar looking to slavery in some respects. Others were able to see some success in certain areas. Of course, you want to talk about that, but to characterize slavery as the way in which they got skills is a bizarre interpretation of this.
It's pretty old, right? In that, slavery by slavery defenders was often depicted as benevolent. So this is in some way as old as time. And it is racist in its construction in the first part, which is that the slaves were just, people without any skills or without any education prior to being taken to the United States against their will. I mean, it erases some of the technical knowledge that a lot of people had before they were enslaved in this country. And like, what is the skills that they were able to translate into being basically small business owners is the implication. I mean, a lot of this was like put into systems of sharecropping, which was a way to further prevent freed Black people from owning the means of production as well.
He says parlayed, like, yeah, they literally could, the quote unquote blacksmith himself could have been parlayed as an individual. He doesn't parlay those skills.
It's about like how slavery was civilizing essentially for Black people. That is the undertone there.
That's what it is. Slavery was a civilizing institution.
Which is talk about political. That's not just political. That's white supremacy.
It's Confederate, yeah.
Yeah, or Confederate's more accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an attempt to both devalue any type of skill sets that existed with slaves, and in fact, it's not hard to find reference within the context of slave markets to people who come from certain regions and having certain backgrounds that might be more amenable for, various tasks. But even if one, like, for instance, we talked about this the other day, that I learned at Monticello, that Jefferson got one of his top enslaved people, if you will, to learn how to cook French meals, and this slave was technically freed when they were in France because they were there during the French Revolution. Jefferson negotiated a deal with him that you will get freed 6 years after returning to the United States, after you transfer those skills that you have learned to someone else who can replace you. I guess it's conceivable that this person went on to, or I guess the implication is like this person could go on to open his own French restaurant after he was, it is the idea is they're trying to say that there was literally benefit to enslaved people from their experience of being enslaved. And this is like saying, your whole family was killed in a car crash, but you really learned how to deal with grief.
Yeah. The whippings, the raping, the starvation in some instances, like that was just a way to kind of build calluses, both figuratively and literally. And then, you could be a real good American bootstrapping person. I mean, it's sick.
Well, we're going to talk to Dave Neiwert in just a moment because one of the hallmarks of or the mechanisms in which a society becomes more fascist and authoritarian is through incremental adaptation, adoptions of new edicts, new laws, and just bit by bit. Because the next round of curriculum changes is, well, they also got personal benefit from maybe skills they learned, but broadly speaking, they got personal benefit in that they were brought to a better country, or they got housing for free. We'll be talking to David Neiwert in just a moment. He's written a new book, The Age of Insurrection, The Radical Right's Assault on American Democracy. In the meantime, we got a sponsorship today. This is a product that came to us years ago. We may have done a little bit of advertising for them, and I tried to get Michael to try it because at the time I was like, I have no need for this, and he wouldn't do it. I think at the time, or I don't know. It was a sensitive issue.
He would have ever done it.
It was a sensitive issue. Maybe he was, but he wasn't going to ever
tell you
concede to it.
I understand.
But Nutrafol came back to us, recently, and Emma had a friend who had used it with a lot of success.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew someone who had a couple of friends who had used it. And then I also started noticing, like, I'm getting up there and my hairline's receding and I got some weird cowlick going on over on this side and things were starting to thin a little bit. So I started to take Nutrafol. I had all the old, some pills that I had, and I ordered new ones. And I've been doing it now for, 6 to 8 months. And I think it's made a huge difference in I can almost like feel it on my head. And the reason why I was so sort of like, I don't want to say I was casual about taking it is because Nutrafol is not a drug. It is a hair growth supplement. It has been clinically shown to improve your hair growth. It helps with thickness and scalp coverage. And it basically, for me, it was like, there's no downside. There's no side effects. There's no potential long-term health, problems. This is something that's actually going to increase my health by, basically, I don't know how they do it exactly. If it just basically affects your cortisol or whatever it is, but Nutrafol's hair growth supplements use a physician-formulated, natural, and science-backed ingredients. Their drug-free, patented technology provides consistent, reliable results without compromising your sexual health, which at times has been important to me. You can now go to Nutrafol.com/men to take their hair health wellness quiz. Identified causes of your thinning hair, and Nutrafol will give you a personalized plan for better hair health through whole body wellness. Nutrafol supports healthy hair growth from within by targeting root causes of thinning hair, such as stress, hormones, environment, nutrition, lifestyle, and metabolism through whole body health. I think I probably have problems with all of those things. And the bottom line is it works. I can say this personally. I mean, Emma has examples. And in a clinical study, 84% of men showed improvement in their hair after 6 months of taking Nutrafol's men's hair growth supplements. Take the first step today to visibly thicker, healthier hair. For a limited time, Nutrafol is offering our listeners $10 off your first month subscription and free shipping when you go to Nutrafol.com/men. Enter the promo code TMR. Find out why over 4,000 healthcare professionals recommend Nutrafol for their healthier hair. Nutrafol.com/men. spelled NUTRAFOL.com/men, and enter promo code TMR. That's Nutrafol.com/men, promo code TMR. Took mine this morning. We will put the link in the podcast and YouTube description. Quick break, and we'll be back with David Neiwert. We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a real pleasure to welcome back to the program freelance journalist David Neiwert, author of The Age of Insurrection, The Radical Right's Assault on American Democracy. Dave, welcome back to the program. We were just joking before we started that I have been reading you online probably 18, 19 years, maybe a little bit longer. And your blog, which I have been apparently mispronouncing for 18 or 19 years, which I thought was Ornicus, and you have just told me I was wrong. So welcome to the program and to one of the biggest clubs in the world, which is correcting my pronunciation.
Yeah. Good to see you, Sam. Yeah, I started or signed us up in 2003.
Okay, 2003. Wow. So there it is. Congratulations. 20 years of me mispronouncing it as Ornicus. All right, so let's just, since we're there, because you have written, I think, at least a half a dozen books now, I think, or pretty close, maybe a couple more even. Tell us the genesis of how you started paying this level of attention to right-wing movements, and particularly sort of like the more authoritarian, extreme right-wing movements in this country.
Sure. Well, some of it was just the waters I grew up in. I grew up in southeastern Idaho, which is both Mormon country and John Birch Society country. So I had family members, all of my neighbors and schoolmates had parents who were heavily into Birch Society conspiracism. And then when I started working in northern Idaho, in my first newspaper job, it was in the late 70s, just a few miles north of where the Aryan Nations set up shop the year before I arrived. And so we started, so I had a lot of reporting on them to do over the years. And of course I had to struggle with how you cover them, that sort of thing. And they were very much part of the background of my news reporting over the ensuing 20 years. And in the early 90s, I started writing about militias before really I think anybody else had, or very many other people had. And mostly before, a few years before Oklahoma City. And so suddenly, I was an environmental reporter, but I was doing these stories as sort of an environmental backlash story. And it wound up being, once Oklahoma City happened, it wound up being a major story. So I had to, I became a militia expert, using air quotes. But I started, in 96, I think, is when I decided to make it a full-time beat.
And I should say the book, walks through, in many respects, or in various areas, gives this historical account and places into context where we are in this moment within a sort of a timeline context. And I want to get back to that one question in the 90s, because I remember there was something that struck me about that era that I think it tells this broader story. But in terms of like coverage, because I know this was also a big question, is how do you cover this? Like, the idea, there is an argument that you don't provide sort of like attention to these folks. And that is, I think, where you started, obviously not where you finished.
Yeah, well, actually, since I was editor of the Little Daily there in Sandpoint, Idaho, in '79, and I sat down with the publisher. I was a pretty young guy. I was 22 years old. So sat down with the publisher and we decided how we were going to handle these guys. And we made what we thought was the astute decision not to cover them because we thought, these guys just want publicity and we're not going to give it to them. And that, reporting on them just helps attract people to their cause. That obviously went out the window within a couple of years. Now, by then I had actually moved on to other papers, but it was pretty obvious that wasn't viable within just a matter of a couple of years, because pretty soon the whole region was awash in all these, this wave of hate crimes that came with the tide of incoming Aryans who moved to the region to support the Aryan nations. And then it culminated in '84 with the rampage of the Order. I don't know if you remember the Order, but they robbed like 24 banks and armored cars and assassinated a radio talk show host in Denver named Alan Berg.
Mm-hmm.
And by then it was incredibly obvious that not covering them was not a viable option. But also, it was pretty clear to me by then that these guys take silence, the non-coverage as sort of a tacit approval. They see silence as a stamp of approval, as a green light, and the purpose that what you have to do is shine a bright spotlight on them and their activities. But you can't do it. You can't do it stupidly. You have to be a complete journalist when you're doing this stuff, which includes providing context, helping your readers understand what it is that they're looking at.
That dilemma, it just reminds me of, a piece that Bob Altemeyer, who you're obviously very familiar with, is like sort of an expert on right-wing authoritarianism, had written in, I think it was the Daily Kos, in 2016, in the early, probably in June, I can't remember exactly, but it was probably like June or May of 2016. It could have even been April, he'd written a couple of missives, before Trump had won the primary, and then I think once afterwards. And he basically said, there's no convincing that you do here. You either beat authoritarians or you don't. And that's sort of the dilemma. Covering or not covering are just two bad options. In terms of if you're looking to stop them, the value of covering these type of movements has nothing to do, it seems to me, with how it directly impacts them as subjects as much as it does in alerting the rest of the country, as it were, to like, you've got a problem here. Like it's, and you need to do something about it, as opposed to like the coverage makes them melt away or this and that. I think it, but let's also just talk about this. I want to, and we may get into some specifics in the book, although because some of the stuff from like January 6th was revealing to me stuff that I did not, that we just don't hear as much about. And maybe I don't pay as much of attention to, but there are narratives that seem to try and downplay all of these things. And that seems to be part of the problem. But what is it? Because I remember in the 90s, under Clinton, there was a resurgence of hate groups. Like we saw, I remember I was a comedian at the time. I had a joke specifically that was based on the premise of like having read that hate groups were on the rise, and there were new numbers of hate groups. And I'm like trying to work out like what makes someone want to create a new hate group. Like, they were disaffected with their old one, whatever. I'll spare people the joke, but this seems to happen under Democratic administrations. And it seemed to really take off during the Obama administration. Tell us broadly, will you put into context these movements through time? Like they never really go away. It's just that there are other times where are more conducive to expansion.
Yeah, well, they seem to go away for a lot of people during the Bush years, for example. And there's no doubt that there is relatively little explicit, militia organizing, hate group organizing activity during those years. But what there actually was going on was this use of the immigration front as a sort of cover for a lot of hate group expansion. In particular, we saw, the Patriot militiamen forming these vigilante border watch groups, the Minutemen and groups like that. So they were still very active. They were just finding a new sort of target to mash the times, because a lot of Patriot militiamen actually saw, the Republican administration as essentially sympathetic to them or helpful to them. And so they weren't quite as agitated, weren't quite as worked up. But, these guys are relentless. They never give up. They always find something new to kvetch about. And they are gonna, they're gonna keep organizing and keep fomenting hate. They just find new targets. So, once Bush was out of office and Obama was elected, then all of a sudden they very much had sort of organizing energy to push back against an African-American presidency. And that continued for 8 years. We definitely saw a different dynamic during the Trump years because that was probably the first time in history that we've seen right-wing extremist groups feel explicitly empowered and enabled by a presidential administration. And, Sarah Posner and I did a project for Mother Jones magazine that was published in October 2016, just before the election, that recounted, we spent about 8 months building this database of all the various ways that Trump was affiliated with and associated with right-wing extremists and vice versa, the way that the sort of associations that he was building. And, the story ran, but it was ignored by the rest of the press, partly because I think the week before Hillary had made her remark about the basket of deplorables. And so it was considered sort of gauche or something. It certainly didn't fit the preferred media narrative at the time that the story came out. So it got buried and ignored. And, and then we spent the next 4 years watching him enable and empower these very groups. The night that he won election, I knew my next 4 years were going to be a nightmare because I knew these groups were going to be unleashed, and yeah, they were. I mean, it was beginning on inauguration night. I was in the middle of a giant protest involving anti-fascists and Milo Yiannopoulos fans in the University of Washington, and a young man was shot right next to me. So the violence was extremely high. I covered probably 17 or 18 Proud Boys / Patriot Prayer / 3% Militia / Oath Keepers events on the West Coast and elsewhere over the next 4 years. So it was, my fears were very much realized.
Let's just drop back up to 10, 20,000 feet here and talk about, like, when we talk about the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers and the Proud Boys and various militias. I mean, all of who are we talking about? Like, how do we, in terms of like the taxonomy here, how do we identify them? They're authoritarians. What are the main sort of, like, I guess, drivers of that authoritarianism? And will you just sort of lay out the definition? Because I think people get confused between the idea of, like, followers who are authoritarians and leaders who are authoritarians, and what it is are the elements that drive that. I want to say ideology, but it really is almost like a personality type.
It's a combination. It's basically how personality types translate into politics, because it's really fascinating to watch. We typically think of authoritarianism in terms of the leaders, the authoritarian leaders that sort of define them, but that's actually only half the dynamic and may not be the decisive dynamic, because none of those people would actually hold power if there weren't a substantial number of people who actively support them, who prefer an autocratic style of government to a democratic style. And that's a lot of what authoritarianism ultimately is about. So authoritarian followers, and the leaders have very distinctly different personalities from the followers. Authoritarian followers are defined by basically three attitudinal and behavioral clusters. The first is authoritarian submission, which is submitting to the will and desire of the great leader, the charismatic leader, and to their following that agenda. The second is authoritarian aggression, which is aggression directed towards anyone who fails to submit or fails to fit into the agenda. And then the third is this called conventionalism. It's this essentially it's the idea that they represent the real America, that they speak for the silent majority, that sort of thing. And those three clusters combine to create a whole long list of traits, which in fact Bob Altmaier has elucidated at length. But they're 10 to 12 really identifiable traits, including susceptibility to conspiracism, a sort of high tolerance for, if not actual participation in bigoted beliefs, as well as this huge overestimation of just how popular they really are.
Is there a through line there with religious fundamentalism? So much of what you describe sounds like that, but it's just almost like using that same structure but for different aims.
Yeah, and well, they actually meld into
all
each
similar, right?
Yeah. We've I've often thought of Christian evangelicalism as a form of religious authoritarianism, and it's but so naturally the religious authoritarianism just flows very neatly into political authoritarianism when the opportunity arises, and we've certainly seen that under Trump.
We should say, we've mentioned Altemeyer's name a couple of times. He was I believe he's still alive. He was a professor at Manitoba University who did about, I think, 25 to 30 years of clinical research on authoritarianism, and had ultimately, come to the conclusion, I think, in partnership with a couple other people he was working with, that that North America, that 25% of the population of North America were right-wing authoritarians. There was also a smaller percentage of left-wing authoritarians, but I think it was in like low single digits. And when you think about what, the definition of authoritarianism is, like submission to a leader, this is, as Emma says, that's what the religion is in many respects, is like you submit to God, and then God has appointed his agents on earth, men, essentially, and the women submit to them, the children to that's the way it's organized, and that's the way it goes. And also God is vengeful. And if God is vengeful, honestly, I mean, if God is aggressive, then it's licensed to us if we're doing it in the name.
It behooves you to be aggressive on his behalf, right?
I mean, it behooves him, supposedly. I mean, this is how it all. This is why it's no coincidence. But what do you say to people who say, "Well, that's just very convenient, the way that you're defining authoritarianism"? But like you're just defining it in like things that you don't like. What do you say to those type of that type of critique? Because I also happen to think it's a motivated critique, but address it first.
Well, I don't come up with these criteria. These are people who are smarter than me and psychologists who actually have studied this phenomenon. I mean, I don't like the Houston Astros either, but I don't come up with with reasons for calling them right-wing extremists, because they clearly aren't. The whole point of authoritarianism in a lot of ways is one of the important things to understand is that levels of authoritarianism can increase under given circumstances, and particularly fear-mongering is known to induce an authoritarian response in the population. And it's also obviously a very easy tool for the personalities who make up the authoritarian leaders. And like I say, they have very different sorts of personalities. They have what we call social dominance orientation in their personalities. And these are basically people who are, who have their narcissism and on steroids. They see the world as revolving around them, and everybody in their world as being manipulatable tools. So, including, of course, their authoritarian followers, which is why Trump will say, he shoots somebody on Fifth Avenue, and his followers would never abandon him. And he's right.
All right. So what drives? There's an authoritarian personality, right? That looks for these sort of like almost like superstructures, if you will, like the idea that you can a suitable leader to submit to and follow, and sometimes that could be like the flag, I guess, on some level, if you're like imposing this aggression, this conventionalism, and that like. It is, almost like another word for aggrievement on some level, I guess, where you feel like you represent the normal common sense perspective on things, and there's some other force that is in somehow sort of tainting that. But where does like white supremacy come in, or is white supremacy a unique part of authoritarianism only in those countries where there is white supremacy? In other words, could you have a right-wing authoritarianism in let's say a predominantly non-white society it just would be animated by something else. But because of the nature of America, white supremacy becomes a part and parcel of that sort of like large cluster of conventionalism.
Yeah, well, it's also important to understand that this stuff's buried in our history and in the American psyche very, very deeply. I mean, conspiracism goes back to at least it goes back to actually to the founding era when George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were dealing with the people who were claiming that they were part of the Illuminati, and the racial hatred certainly and racial bigotry that fuels a lot of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the origins of white supremacy go back to at least the middle 1800s, but certainly came into full fruition in the early 1900s when we had, the lynching era, when we had campaigns against open campaigns against Asians and other minorities in this country, as well as all kinds of immigrants. Nativism is as old as mom and apple pie in this country. So this stuff goes back a long ways. It's very much buried in our psyche. And I think people like Trump and these Republican authoritarians are just tapping into stuff, the lizard brain that's kind of existing already in the country, but was very eager to jump forth. And there's also no question that a lot of what's enabled this has been a real destruction of democratic institutions, a hollowing out of democratic institutions, and particularly the media and our information space. The way that corporate media have permitted the spread of conspiracism within their realm. This is not something that I'm an old dog newsman who was around in the 70s, and this stuff was not allowed back then, and it's just, I think, outrageous to a lot of us who've been in the profession as journalists for a long time that it's just shrugged at now.
Let's talk a little bit more specifically on some of the things you're talking about in terms of like insurrection and sedition and sort of the MAGA movement. Has the aspiration always to be for these folks to be insurrectionists because ultimately we have a democratic republic, and that is problematic, but it's just sort of like it has metastasized or progressed the evolution of this movement within this country, which has always been there, like you say, but at different times gets sort of like re-energized. Is that where we are now? I mean, that like there is, it is just, they have bought into a full-on assault on democracy. Right now we have in Alabama, the Alabama legislature said, we're not going to follow the insistence of this right-wing Supreme Court, let's be clear, to draw a second majority congressional majority-minority congressional district. And now we, of course, it's too bad Scalia is dead. We can't make sure that he watches this to understand why the Voting Rights Act was important when they assaulted Section 5. Again, maybe Roberts is starting to pick up on it, but is that where we at? I mean, is that why like this book is about insurrectionists, where you didn't use that term necessarily a couple of books ago?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't have used the term a couple of books ago because, I mean, seditionists, yeah. I had a quote in the New York Times a few years ago where I said, yeah, these patriots, they call themselves patriots, but you never met a more seditionist bunch in your lives. And this is true. And I've been hanging out with them and studying them since the 90s. Truly, they've always been about a kind of a weird kind of sedition that wraps itself in patriotic bunting. and but yeah, I think that a lot of where we're at has to do with this hostility to democracy as a viable system. In fact, this is one of the things that you'll always hear them pop out of their mouths is, this isn't a democracy, it's a republic, right? I mean, this is actually something that I've been hearing since I was a kid in high school from the John Birchers, because it was in fact a sort of adage concocted by the John Birchers way back when, in the early 60s. It was, I think, one of Robert Welch's cornerstones for the John Birch Society. And it's a lie. It's just a flat out lie, and it's a dangerous lie, because it can, we are, of course, a democratic republic. They'll say, oh, it's a constitutional republic, which is a complete non sequitur, because every republic has a constitution, right? So
why do they promulgate this? Why do they promulgate this as a way of saying that, like, our leaders know best, essentially? Is that when they say that we're a republic as opposed to a democratic republic, they're saying, we vote, they get to do whatever they want.
Well, I mean, remember keep in mind that, of course, China is a republic, North Korea is a republic. These are all republics as well. And so, you can have a complete autocratic dictatorship, and it calls itself a republic. And that's exactly what I believe these folks want, and what they manifested on January 6th. They were not simply protesting. This is not just a protest gotten out of hand. They were attempting to install Donald J. Trump as the U.S. president for life. There was never going to be an end to a Trump administration as long as he was alive, as far as they were concerned. And that was the whole impetus. That was the purpose of the attempted insurrection and Trump's coup attempt, which was, part of the same thing. They were definitely complementary actions, and they were designed to be that way.
Is there an awareness that their ideas that they're trying to enforce, not just the leaders that they're backing, are that they are minority issues, in the sense that they don't have the majority to back them, and that's where the impulse comes from, the urgency to install the leader that's going to that they're going to favor, or that they follow?
I think in a sublimated way. I don't think they'll ever admit that sort of directly. What instead they do is resort to fear-mongering about the changing demographics in America, that pretty soon whites will no longer be over 50% of the population. That's probably in about 20 years, of course, but that's real soon for them. and there's a lot of this is built on the dread of the fear of the loss of that influence and power that accrues to white people. And ultimately that's what white supremacism is about. I mean, it comes out of that whole eugenicist view of the 1920s that tried to stop Asian immigration in the 1920s, because they feared that all these Asians coming from China and Japan were going to overwhelm the population of Americans, particularly on the West Coast. And there were whole books, bestsellers, written on this subject. And these beliefs got really embedded into the American psyche. So
let's get back to January 6th, because there are two sort of competing narratives. One is it's a protest by a bunch of boomers who are upset, and it just got a little bit out of hand. But you can see police ushering them in. And then maybe there's three narratives. The other narrative is that no, these were violent people, but without plans. Who are just sort of like rushing in the heat of the moment, and they got stirred up, and they got carried away in certain instances, and maybe if there was better crowd control, they would have been, sort of put in their place early on. And then there's also, I think, there's a theory, or maybe that's not strong enough a word, that those people got riled up in that way as cover for what other people thought was a very sort of like specific plan to change the outcome of that election in that moment. Walk us through this. I mean, I think at one point in your book you talk about the SWAT team that had to like have everybody lay on the floor as they escorted people out. Like, I wasn't quite aware of that from the news coverage per se.
Right.
Walk us through what you really think was going on that day.
Well, I think that there certainly is some truth, particularly to those second and third strands. I don't think it's the whole picture. I do think that this was a mob that was planned for and encouraged and gathered by Donald Trump. He clearly had the intention of unleashing them on Congress that day to try to prevent the Electoral College ballots from being counted. And he hoped that the mob would be able to, that his minions inside of Congress would be able to delay things long enough for the mob to completely interrupt the counting, and then there would be this huge delay at which he would be able to manipulate media and manipulate perceptions enough that he could write out his loss and contest it in the courts and so on and so forth. And that was clearly it was complementary to John Eastman's plan to have these slates of fake electors and that sort of thing. And it actually, and this is something I did try to lay out in the book, is that they came frighteningly close to succeeding. That mob very nearly overtook the Senate. They were only they were mere steps away from Mike Pence when he escaped down those stairs. Mitt Romney was very nearly ran head on right into the mob, and he certainly would have been lynched. And then when, of course, in the infamous scene where Ashley Babbitt,
do you think they would have killed? I mean, do you think that they would have? You do think they would have killed?
Yeah. If that mob had gotten a hold of any members of Congress, they'd have been dead.
AOC was mocked for fearing for her life as she barricaded herself in her office. I mean, anyone, like, as a not to pull the woman card here, but like I would 100%, based on the way that the conservative media apparatus had portrayed her, be fearful of sexual assault. At the very least.
Well, and remember, Paul Gosar was on the floor of the House nattering endlessly about the Arizona vote while the mob was entering the building. And it looked to me like he was purposely delaying. And finally, the House authorities took over and said, no, we're ending this and we're evacuating. And so remember in that famous scene when they were entering through the Speaker's office, or trying to enter through the Speaker's office, and Ashley Babbitt and her friends were there banging on the windows. They were looking at what drove Ashley Babbitt to an absolute frenzy, was seeing members of Congress still walking out. They were within maybe 30 yards of these members of Congress evacuating out those doors. And they were going, they're getting away. And that's when Babbitt, somebody broke the window and Babbitt tried to jump through. And fortunately, a guard did his duty and shot her. So, that was what was going on that day.
What has happened in the wake of January 6th? Like what's the status of, let's say, the Proud Boys, who are the sort of you described them as the sort of the street fighting gang, like I mean, the brown shirts. That doesn't mean that they're Nazis. It also doesn't mean that they're not Nazis.
Right.
We should say.
I would say they're neo-fascist myself.
And
so.
and maybe while you're here, since before we get to that question, much has been made, it seems to me, by the fact that, particularly we just recently had a neo-Nazi shooter who was Hispanic. Much has been made about this, notion. How do you explain the idea that non-white people, and I think that, there's a very simple, we all practice white supremacy within our society. We all do it in some form or another. Sometimes we don't know that we're doing it. It is a practice. It is one where the value of white people is, placed over those who are not white. But once you start getting into the sort of like these more violent groups, the white supremacy becomes more explicit and more aggressive. How do you explain for people the fact that people will be part of the Proud Boys, which is a sort of at the very least a neo-fascist organization? It seems to me certainly authoritarian, almost definitionally. Where do these people fit in? And then we'll talk about what's been going on since January 6th.
Yeah. Well, you're right. White supremacy sort of operates on a spectrum, and some of it's, very small, depending on, how earnestly you work to try to minimize it, and or don't, how earnestly you work to emphasize it. I think white nationalists like, Nick Fuentes and people like that are very much sort of the apotheosis of where white supremacy is going, because they're white nationalists and they want a white ethno state that also excludes Jews, actually that persecutes Jews, and then also relegates non-white people to subjugated status. Not just minority, but you don't get any power. You're subjects of the white state, and that's what a lot of white nationalists push for, and that's what a lot of them really believe in. And so there is a spectrum of people who, sort of edge towards that belief. Maybe exist in a Netherlands between just straight up conservatism and white ethno-nationalism, but there are. And there's a large number of those, but eventually I think the gravitational pull of these white nationalist beliefs is really powerful and draws them farther down that hole, which is where we are today with a lot of these groups. I mean, certainly they don't give up, and that's, we saw notably with the Proud Boys. After January 6th, they didn't go back in their holes. They didn't go back and hide. Now, I would say that the Oath Keepers are pretty much a dead letter right now. They're like a non-entity, mainly because that organization was really built around Stuart Rhodes, and he was the primary impetus for it. So he's doing 20 years in prison, and I don't think he's going to be recruiting a lot of people, except maybe some of them in prison. But I don't think he has a whole lot of credibility within the far-right movement anymore. But what we did see, certainly with Proud Boys, Three Percenters, other militias, as well as, the constitutional sheriffs and a lot of other far-right organizations, is that they've actually really doubled down since January 6th, but they've also done a sort of diffusion strategy where they spread out and emphasize local organizing on a major basis. And this also, I should mention, includes Christian nationalists who are doing very much the same sort of thing, where they're trying to, they don't organize sort of national uprisings like a la January 6th, but rather they try to organize what I call 100 little insurrections around the country, targeting school boards and health districts and city councils and county commissions and state legislatures. And they come out so we've got an example right now in the Temecula area and in Glendale, California, where Proud Boys are coming out to attack, as they always do. They are pick up on the right-wing controversy du jour, which right now is the anti-LGBTQ demonization of that community, calling them groomers, and attacking school districts and library boards for carrying any kind of material that might be friendly to them. And so they're attacking these school boards, like in Glendale. these guys don't even have kids in the school district, right? And they're showing up to
I would imagine many of them don't even have kids. I mean, but is do they do that? Do fascists do that because they know when they see blood in the water, as it were, they see, some particular marginalized group being attacked by, sort of like more mainstream, I guess, society, more mainstream voices. They see blood in the water, and it doesn't matter to them exactly the specifics. Right. That the dynamic of attacking a weak contingency of society builds some other force that will help in their agenda. Is that what's going on there?
Sure. I mean, I just think about what happened in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho last year, where, there's going to be just their normal Pride in the Park, an annual event, very peaceful, very happy time. And it drew protests back in the late 80s and early 90s, but since then had been really widely accepted by the community. And then all of a sudden, because of a lot of the groomer rhetoric, the libs of TikTok stuff that was floating around last year, they started the Christian nationalists in the area actually organized and fomented a campaign against that Pride in the Park event, and it went viral nationally, and yes, was promoted by libs of TikTok as well. And who should show up at this event, which I went and covered, but the neo-fascist Patriot Front group. And let's be clear, Patriot Front really is explicitly neo-fascist. They walk around with a banner that has a fasces it's like red, white, and blue, but in the blue, it's a fasces. And they're very explicitly pro-fascist. And these guys walk around, you may know them from, they always wear the white hoods and the blue shirts and the denim or the khakis, right? And that's their uniform. They try to march and create problems. And that's what they were doing in Coeur d'Alene that day. Fortunately, the police caught them and pulled them over and arrested them all on the lawn outside the park. And I was there to get their pictures as the cops did the Ruby Roo thing and pulled their masks off. So I got a lot of ID shots that day.
So what can we do? I mean, obviously, what does a society do in this situation to deal with this? Well, what is your prognosis, maybe?
Some of it is just take it seriously. I mean, the first thing is that we have to take it seriously. I mean, there's just way too much of sort of blithe dismissal. Oh, they're just on the fringe. There's just a few of them. What are their numbers? They're just a tiny amount. But well, actually, there's hundreds of thousands of people.
Do you really need a big? But I mean, stopping there for a moment. How many do we need? I mean, because it seems to me, my experience in politics has always been that an extraordinary a far smaller number of people, because, I've been doing this now for 18 years. And one of the things that I've, discussed with people, like, you're just preaching to the choir. And I'm like, well, to be honest with you, politics is really just sort of a competition between choirs. To a large extent, that's basically what it is. I mean, right. Like the most obvious, just sort of actual number, was like 3 million people respond to the FCC about net neutrality, and it completely, changed the course of where we were going net neutrality. They just sent in comments. Never mind, like they were agitating and marching and this and that. The civil rights movement was not about the mobilization of 80% of the country or 70% of the country, or even 50% of the country. It was you don't need that many people to to change the course of American politics, if they are, particularly if they're, as invested as, willing to use violence in certain instances.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, even when it was just truly a fringe phenomenon in the 1990s, Oklahoma City and the Atlanta Olympic pipe bombing were really profound events that shook the country. Having many more people who hold Tim McVeigh style beliefs is really a problem. And yeah, the University of Chicago did this study where they looked at how widespread these attitudes are, and they found that basically about 20% of the country believes so doggedly, so firmly in these sort of authoritarian views that they are willing to commit violence in defense of these views. They believe that violence is a legitimate way to achieve those ends. When you have 20% of the country that believes that, as the study pointed out, you're talking, 60 million people. That's a significant, that is significant. That's no longer fringe. Yes, it may be a minority, but it's so large that it can have a really profound effect on us.
We should also say that even within the context of sort of like mainstream politics, we have minoritarian rule in this country. I mean, there's just no other way of putting it. I mean, we have a Senate that is dominated by a minority, or I should say, overrepresented by the Democrats. It's certainly not a 52 or 51, 49 breakdown in terms of who's voted for this. The last two Republican presidents came into office with a minority of people voting for them. So this concept is like, it's not that foreign, particularly if so. I guess sort of like give us a sense of where we're going then with this. I mean, if Donald Trump wins, I've heard you say, and I tend to agree with you, like there is no incentive for him not to go further. Like he was, he did the subtle plan this time around, which was pretty explicitly trying to throw the election. If he wins again, he's probably learned his lesson. That maybe I shouldn't be so subtle.
Well, that's, I think, pretty clear. He's already been making speeches about what he plans to do if he's president. And he's very explicit in essentially saying that he intends to overwhelm the other branches of government, essentially turn the executive branch into a sole ruling branch of government. And that he intends to, be able to fire anyone in government who he wants to.
That was something they actually set up on their way out last time, was to institute a mechanism in which to sort of undercut civil service rules.
Right. Yeah, and essentially what he's been outlining in his speeches is a straight up recipe for a full-on autocracy revolving around the executive branch. And and he's been pretty unapologetic in making this.
How does where does popularity come in? Because a lot of times, like I saw an interview with you actually where the interviewer was like, well, Ron DeSantis is popular in Florida. Well, so how could he be an authoritarian? How could he could be fashy? And where, what role does that popularity play in this? And also, how do we go from like, okay, 49% of the country, or 48% of the country, 47% of the country supported Donald Trump, and he won because of the Electoral College, and by 60, 70,000 votes over the course of 3 states, and now he's basically become a dictator. I mean, in some ways, I guess I don't even know why. Like today, we just had what happened in Israel. I mean, on top of the what I would consider, and I'm not alone in this, an apartheid state for the Israeli Jewish population, they're starting to see like it's taken another step now. The authoritarian sort of like I would say fasci rule that has been ruling over Palestinians is now crossed sort of like some type of like threshold where it's now we're going to do this amongst the Israeli Jews who are not, ultra nationalist or, ultra orthodox. And they have now gotten rid of essentially the independent judiciary. It's still there, still functioning, but they can be overridden at any time by an existing government, almost definitionally, because you need 51%. And is that how it happens? Like this incrementalism? I mean, presumably the Israeli government was popular. That's how they got elected.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I remember Milton Meyer's book, They Thought They Were Free, which is about the descent of Germany into full-on fascism and how it happened incrementally. It happened in small, tiny steps that, nobody felt like opposing at the time because it felt so small. And each time, each increment just kept building and building the thing. And that's certainly what we've been seeing in the United States, with these very small incremental steps that hollow out our democracy from within. And this includes, the noxious influence of extreme wealth in our political system and in the information system. But also, it's one of those things that it's a popularity doesn't mean that it's not authoritarian. If authoritarianism is popular itself, and that's certainly what we're seeing happen both in, Florida, as well as in Texas, as well as in Idaho, where an authoritarian style of ruler, basically an autocratic ruler, is popular for being autocratic. That doesn't mean that it's a democratic thing. It's rather the opposite, that they are overwhelming the ability of all members of society to have a say. I mean, the whole point of democracy is to empower every single person in society with some level of political power. And when that is when an autocracy overwhelms it, then that means, all of these, particularly minority groups, are going to be just overwhelmed and facing all kinds of, persecution as well as oppression. And this, we're certainly seeing this with the LGBTQ community in Florida. That's, not a not insubstantial part of the Florida population is actually at risk of being overwhelmed by Ron DeSantis' authoritarianism.
And we saw them start sort of like with immigrants, and it's just moving, almost like through some type of list as to, who is the most disempowered, and then after we've dealt with them, who is the next most disempowered or marginalized or vulnerable or whatever it is at that time.
Well, that's always been part of the dynamic, because we've talked about eliminationism before, Sam, and how it works, and that certainly is one of the sort of threads that runs through all this rhetoric. And part of the right-wing authoritarian mentality is that they see themselves as heroes. They are always going to be heroic. And this is true of every one of these individuals. It's certainly true of every right-wing extremist that I've ever talked to, as well as every right-wing far-right terrorist that I've ever studied. They all see themselves as heroic, as being heroes out to save society. And part of the dynamic of heroism is that they have to, you can't be a hero there's no hero without being an enemy. There has to be an enemy. And so they frequently concoct their enemies out of whole cloth, whether it's, communists in the 60s and 70s, or immigrants in the early 2000s, or more recently, it's Antifa, the big Antifa boogeyman, as well as more recently the critical race theory, and now
that's what I was going to ask you. Is like, what do you say to people who you're talking about these like small groups of so-called authoritarians, but what about wokeism? Isn't that a huge authoritarian movement? What's your response to that?
It's not authoritarian. It's functional. It's shaming.
Well, why isn't wokeism authoritarian?
Well, for one thing, it doesn't attempt to wield the power of the state on behalf of their beliefs. And secondly, it's not meant to oppress a single class of people. Rather, it's meant to the whole point of wokeism is to defend oppressed minority classes, or what they call wokeism. I mean, I've been trying to get them to figure out what the definition of woke is, and the best I can come up with
when you see it though,
that it's just basic common decency is what I think it is, but that's the way I was raised. So,
David Neiwert, real pleasure to have you on the program. The book is The Age of Insurrection, The Radical Right's Assault on American Democracy. We will put a link to that in the YouTube and podcast description. Again, really, real pleasure to talk to you about this stuff.
As always, Sam, and nice meeting you, Emma.
Nice to meet you as well. Thank you.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break, head into the fun half of the program. Just a reminder, it is your support that makes this show possible. You can become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. When you do, you not only become a member of the show, you help the show survive and thrive, but you also get the free half, free of commercials, and you get some goodies in the fun half, all sorts of different things like that. And don't forget Just Coffee, but Just Coffee, and I'm looking this up here because I forgot. It is Just Coffee has a special sale going on this week until through the 27th. And that is 25% off your Just Coffee for 3 more days. JustCoffee.coop, 25% off. Use the coupon code MR25. In fact, can we get the Twitter feed to pump that out, Bradley? Sure. MR25, you get 25% off of Just Coffee. This is a great time for you to try the different types of Just Coffee that they have. You got the MR blend, you got the WTF blend. I don't know if that's really worth trying, but the Maya Super Dark, the Bike Fuel, these are some of my favorites. They also have a cold brew coffee, but they have it's all fair trade. Very supportive of the farms that provide for them the coffee beans. They have long-time relationships with these farms. Started in the Zapatista, the Zapatistas, I think back in the late 60s. 70, I can't remember exactly when this started, but and they're a co-op. So justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee to your chocolate. Again, MR25 for 25% off. Do yourself a favor. Oh, I didn't mean the Twitter feed. I meant the X thingamajig. The X.
You got to exit out.
Exits. Could you exify that?
X times over. Stat.
Yes. Excellent. Oh, Emma, what's happening on EXVN?
We will
I've just
be
been Xified.
Yes, hell yeah. We'll be talking about the big news of Dan Snyder finally selling the Washington franchise and being fined on the way out. We'll also talk about the running back labor coalition that seems to be forming, what action they could potentially take in the fall. And then we'll have some fun looking at some of these new uniforms. I gotta say, hate the Nike-ification of the NFL. Keep the classics the classic. That's a little preview to my old man yells at cloud analysis. YouTube.com/ESVN show for today.
Matt, what's happening on Left Rexening?
Yeah, that's not what we haven't renamed it. Left Reckoning it continues this Sunday, or actually yesterday. We did the final installment of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which is a Marx sort of analysis of the period between 1848 and 1851, where there was a revolution and then a counter-revolution. It's a really good way of looking at politics. I think it's a really engaging reading, but also there's this thing getting really popular among populists, shall we call them, that are like, oh, the uniparty. And when people say uniparty, yeah, exactly, like as opposed to understanding these two parties as like two different like types of capital, for instance, and then different coalitions behind that, people say it as the uniparty, and that has never been a good way of looking at politics. It basically it's the opposite of class analysis, and I just think people who say that are like, they hate both parties, but they also aren't socialists. So check that out, patreon.com/leftreckoning.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and head into the fun half, or what I call the X first half.
Wow.
Formerly the first half goes into...
You sound like you could be the richest man on the planet with that kind of thinking.
Send me my billions. I just changed the name of the Majority Report to the X Report.
Hoo.
Yeah, we had a whole team of people coming up with a new name for the show. And where's my $1 billion?
I mean, David Sachs first on the phone line.
This is going to revolutionize left media.
Revolutionize.
646-257-3920. See you in the fun half. Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude. You want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
Some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2. 5 8s. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance.
Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook. Throw our hands up.
Ooh.
Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up!
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
Back.
We are back, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so
Hello.
much for having us in your.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us over.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having
Yeah.
us. Thanks for having us. Really
Should I take my
appreciate
shoes
it.
off?
I didn't bring anything, but
I've been
I'm
exified.
very demanding.
I've been
Okay.
exified. I'm sorry. Jessica Kajix. I'm having trouble pronouncing the whole name. I'm making my mom and dad listen to Majority Report on a road trip. Could I perhaps get a shofar for them? Yes, indeed. This is for mom and dad. Thank you, Jessica.
Tuning in.
There you go. There it is. Let's get into this. Here is Mike Pence. I don't think he knowingly is trying to show how so-called exceptions